Hey everyone, welcome to another artwork analysis. Now, why limit myself to just illustration and fine arts? I feel I have to tap into photography because photography is reference to illustrators and fine artists. So it's something that you have to be able to look into in order to get inspired, to get more inspiration. So what better way than to look at one of the most prominent art photographers in Asia, and that's Fan Ho. Now, this guy is incredible. If you look up his photography, you realize that it's pretty much no different than a lot of concept artists nowadays. I guarantee you a lot of artists nowadays, especially when you look into media like Ghost in the Shell, would have taken ideas from Fan Ho. This guy was doing things in the 50s that we are still trying to do in our art. Now, I'm going to be talking about three things as usual. First of all, I'm going to go back into three value compositions. Despite the fact that he has to take photos of the environment and he's limited to that environment, he still has immaculate sense of three value compositions. Now, the second thing is the idea of vectors. He has incredible use of vectors despite the fact that he's not fabricating any of these scenes. He's just taking what's available in the environment. Last of all, I'm just going to be talking about lighting. Lighting is something that's sort of natural to photography. That's not something you control, but let's try to apply it to art terms as well. So, when it comes to three value compositions, quite simply, again, we have to think about it from a zoomed out perspective. This is especially true since photography tends to capture a lot more details than you might want at times. So you either have to fabricate the scene, as in you have to create the scene in a studio and maybe adjust things here and there, sort of like the Hollywood approach, of course, or you have to be able to sense certain things working and also control the contrast after you take the photograph. So right off the bat, you see there is a three value composition. Now, it might be more subtle than the previous video, but it's still there. It would be something like this. Something like this. Now, of course, Fan Ho wasn't able to just create his own concrete environments. You know what I mean. It's just not going to be possible. He's not some rich, super rich dude who could just build his own sets. But he angled it perfectly in order to create a masterful composition. This is not easy to balance, and right off the bat, you notice that even in three values, it works. And you gotta consider, he's not painting this. So he had to be able to see it for himself and think, oh, this definitely looks like something I can take a photo of and make it work. Now, of course, when it comes to photography, he probably camped this place for quite a while in order to get the perfect angle, to get the perfect composition of the people walking down the stairs. If any of these characters, quote unquote, were in different positions, this composition wouldn't work as well because of how the balance works. So, just a little bit not in the same topic as throughout composition, notice that we have scaling, sort of like what I talked about in my previous video, the idea that there's different sizes of characters as it goes in distance, and also the fact that she balances off smaller characters here, and these buildings also make you come back and look at it. So that's going to be going into vectors. But anyways, point is, even in photography, the idea of three values work. Goes to show you, despite the fact that this photo was taken 60-something years ago, these fundamentals still work. And I won't go too much more into it, just know that you have to simplify. Always think simple before you think complex. Alright, so let's talk about vectors now. Vectors are something, again, that's sort of like natural to the environment, but you have to be able to pick it out when you're doing photography. Now, of course, when you're painting, you have to be aware of what you are painting yourself, but this is something that when it comes to just looking at your environments, looking at your surroundings, or trying to take photos of it, these sort of things kind of come naturally. And you want to be able to know when it occurs. So notice how the perspective creates a nice vector here towards the stairs, and then this area here makes you get drawn back into the piece. Now, people kind of misinterpret what compositions are supposed to do. I've talked about in the previous video, ultimately you want your movements, you want your vectors in your piece to keep your audience into your artwork. So you realize that when you look at this photo, you kind of get drawn into it. You're as if you are going back 60-something years ago in Hong Kong. You don't want to look away. And that's a lot of cases subconscious for audiences. But as an artist, especially if you're painting instead of just taking a photograph, you have to be aware of where your vectors are pointing at. So vectors, again, are just movements, sort of like hinting your audience into where they need to look. So as you can see here, everything works perfectly in order to give a notice on the main vector, which is the main focal point, which is the interaction of these three characters here. And everything works around this interaction. Make sure that whatever message you're trying to go for, you are noting where your vectors are pointing. Now, final point, the idea of lighting. Now, lighting is super important when it comes to art, especially when you're painting it. So I've talked about making sure your lighting is consistent in your scene. In photography, you don't have to worry about consistency because ultimately you are taking a photograph of a real scene, meaning lighting will naturally work in your favor, work consistently. However, it doesn't mean that you can neglect the fact that lighting is just a tool of creating your three-value composition. Now, if you are painting this, you have to realize that lighting is always secondary. I understand that a lot of artists think otherwise, but composition always comes first, a two-dimensional scene. It doesn't matter if you paint the perfect, most logical lighting. If your lighting is perfect, but your composition is not good because of it, then your lighting is not justified. Your artwork always comes first. It's not logic. Never think about it logically. So in this case, Fan Ho kind of just gets the lighting in his favor. Everything kind of works in his favor in creating the composition. But of course, he can't really control this other than staying at the place for 24 hours and making sure he gets the right composition. But as an artist, you have to take note of, okay, now that I have a 3-value composition, what lighting will give you this 3-value composition? If this was done in a night scene, let's say I invert this like this, it might still work, but it gives an entirely different impression. So note that if you have to justify, let's say you paint this sort of 3-value composition, then you gotta be like, okay, maybe I need to make a night scene. If the sky is naturally going to be dark, then of course it has to be night. Justify your compositions. Don't try to justify your lighting. Your lighting will only be as good as if your design of your piece works. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I'm not going to go over too much, but this is a rim backlighting. Very common in concept art, so take note of his work, Fan Ho's work, because if you are really into this concept art style, you have a lot to learn when it comes to from looking at his work. Even though his work is 60-something years old in general. And that's very impressive. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.